Welcome, everyone, to the Classic English Literature Podcast. We're that little bubble floating in the ether where rhyme gets its reason. This is our first show that's not about Shakespeare. The first one for quite some time. And I feared for the psychological health of regular listeners if we just quit him cold turkey. I don't want any of you out there getting the literary DTs. So I thought, we'll wean ourselves off a bit, move one step beyond the bard himself to, perhaps, one of his close inner circle. In the last episode on his sonnets, I noted that the final couple dozen or so are addressed to a persona scholars call the Dark Lady, and I also listed a few of the major candidates for her real-life counterpart. The frontrunner of these is a woman called Aemelia Lanyer, who happens to be the first Englishwoman to seek patronage and publish a volume of poetry in exactly the manner a man might. Yeah, she's the first one. And it is to that volume of poetry that we turn our attention today. Now, before we do, please remember that the email at which I can be reached is classicenglishLiterature@gmail.com. That's classicenglishLiterature@gmail.com, all one word. Send along any questions, thoughts, suggestions, or rapturous compliments. I like those especially. TikTok is still a thing as of this recording, as is Facebook and Instagram, so be sure to follow those for updates and oddities. The support the show button eagerly awaits the gentle tap of your finger should you care to make a financial contribution. Keep the lights on and the cat fed, you know. Thanks for all your support. I am eternally obliged. Despite her manifold contributions to English literature, readers forgot Aemelia Lanyer for simply ages until, in the late 20th century, feminist scholars rediscovered and reevaluated her poetry. Today, most see her as a significant figure in early modern English literature, and a pioneering voice for women's rights and perspectives. Lanyer was born around 1569, likely in London. She's the daughter of Baptista Bassano, a musician of Venetian Jewish descent who had settled in England. We don't know much about Lanyer's early life, education, or family background, but we suppose she was likely well-educated, possibly through the patronage of Susan Bertie, the Countess of Kent. Her association with the Herbert family, particularly with Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke and sister to Sir Philip Sidney, and she herself was a notable literary figure and patron, that connection allowed the young poet's work to gain some recognition among the cognoscenti. Even her day job had a bit of glamour. She served as the maid of honor to Queen Elizabeth I, and later to Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I. Lanyer's most famous work is Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, published in 1611, a work significant not only for its literary merit, but also for its feminist themes and theological arguments. Here, Lanyer defends women's virtue and capabilities, critiques male-dominated interpretations of religious texts, and celebrates the role of women in Christianity, particularly focusing on the figure of Eve. It's mostly a series of dedicatory poems, a bit of strategic toadying for past and potential patrons. We've got a couple to Good Queen Bess, one to Lucy, Countess of Bedford, and Countess of Dorset, and so on and so on. There's also a shout-out to, quote, all virtuous ladies in general, scooping up any fish that may have avoided the initial net. Deft but typical paeans to their greatness and generosity and Christian example. The title of the volume and its eponymous poem translates from the Latin as Hail God, King of the Jews, which recalls to us the satiric inscription placed above Jesus at his crucifixion. The poem is, appropriately, a meditation on the Passion of Christ, which draws a distinction between the flawed and vicious men involved in the death and resurrection of Christ and the good and compassionate women who attempt to minister through it. And the poem is also among the first female-authored entries in an informal body of texts called the Querelle des Femmes, variously translated as the woman question or the dispute of women. The term, regardless of its translation, indicates a group of writings from the Middle Ages through the early modern period, delineating and debating the nature of women, usually written, of course, by men who, after all, understand female experience best. Without identifying them as such, we have discussed a couple of the more notable entries already on this show. We've talked about Chaucer's Wife of Bath and Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Now, certainly, not all such texts evidence the nuance and subtlety of mind apparent in Alison and Catherine. Many, unsurprisingly, dwelt upon the familiar negative assumptions about women. You know, they're mentally inferior, emotionally unstable, easily tempted to vice, and just generally untrustworthy. But Lanyer and her contemporaries meet such calcified misogyny with reasoned argument and eloquent address. The best and most famous example of this in Salve is the subsection called Eve's Apology in Defense of Women, and this is what we'll focus on today. It's a rather audacious mashup of two biblical incidents, the first, of course, being the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden, and the second is the dream of Pontius Pilate's wife during Jesus' trial in Jerusalem. Here is the relevant passage from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 27, verse 19, and I quote, "When Pilate was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." In fact, the speaker of the poem is Mrs. Pilate, who uses the apostrophic mode to urge her husband from condemning the Galilean preacher. In doing so, not only does Lanyer call our attention to a rather minor female character in the Gospels, but she also does much to renovate Pilate's wife's reputation in the Jacobean age. Pilate's wife was a rather prominent figure in the medieval mystery plays at York. We talked about those in a previous episode. Now, in those tellings, her dream is a spell from the devil, warning her that if Jesus dies, the Pilates will lose their power. So she becomes something of an updated Eve, duped by suggestible weakness. Before we begin a close reading of the poem, let me clarify a couple of things about the title, Eve's Apology in Defense of Women. Firstly, Eve is not the speaker. Yeah, that's Pilate's wife. And secondly, we must not think of an apology here as an admission of guilt or a plea for forgiveness. Rather, an apology, as used in this sense, is a defense or a justification of something. So, the poem seeks to justify Eve's complicity in the fall of humanity through Mrs. Pilate's reasoned argument against her husband executing Jesus of Nazareth. Lanyer writes a series of iambic pentameter octaves, that is, 8-line stanzas, the first 6 lines of which alternately rhyme, A, B, A, B, A, B. She concludes each with a heroic couplet, introducing a third rhyming sound, CC. And I'm so happy she does it this way. It lends some dignity and perhaps even heroism to the defense. Let's have a look at stanza 1. Here it is. Now Pontius Pilate is to judge the cause of faultless Jesus, who before him stands, who neither hath offended prince nor laws, although he now be brought in woeful bands. O noble governor, make thou yet a pause, do not in innocent blood imbrue thy hands, but hear the words of thy most worthy wife, who sends to thee to beg her Saviour's life. Fittingly, obviously, The opening establishes the frame narrative of the poem. The Roman procurator has been given the case against an allegedly seditious Galilean, but is interrupted by his wife, who will privately plead the case for the defendant. The stanza, as it focuses on Jesus' innocence and faultlessness, will come to establish a parallel to the subaltern position of women, which, of course, necessitates the exhortation of line 7 to, quote, hear the words of his wife. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the first A rhyme at the end of line 1, and the word is cause. My edition glosses the word as case, which makes sense, right, in a judicial setting such as this. So Lanyer could have used that word, case, not cause. The sense of case as an instance of litigation had been in use in English since the late 1300s. And case certainly would have been easy to rhyme later in the stanza. So why does she pick cause instead? Cause, meaning to produce an effect, came into English at about the same time, late 14th century. But its use as motive or grounds for action predates that by about 2 centuries. So either would have done. But if we keep our eyes on the enjambment, now, enjambment is a term which means that the sentence in a poem continues past the meter of the line. We get some interesting additional resonances from cause that would not be so with case. So if we read lines 1 and 2 together as a single independent clause and not, as people often clumsily do, as 2 disparate lines of verse, we get, quote, now Pontius Pilate is to judge the cause of faultless Jesus who before him stands. I count at least 5 meanings at work here for the word cause. 1, the legal case itself. 2, the grounds for action against Jesus. 3, that which advocates for Jesus, like I'll support his cause, that kind of thing. 4, that which Jesus himself believed in, the cause he supports. And 5, the reason Jesus existed, the incarnation itself, the cause that affects the salvation of humanity. That's quite a bit of heavy lifting for a single syllable to take on, but Lanyer manages it elegantly.
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Halle Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Halle Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
Stanza 2 argues that true justice is paradoxically the administration of mercy. Pilate is urged to, quote, take affliction's part. She continues an appeal to the senses, not only hear, but now, quote, open thine eyes that thou the truth mayst see. That truth is, startlingly, that Jesus is Pilate's savior, a fact Mrs. Pilate already perceives. Women are routinely faster at noticing such things. But the couplet for stanza 2 almost seems a non sequitur. Line 7 reads, quote, let not us women glory in men's fall. Now, is this a shift in address? Is she talking to herself? Talking to the reader? And what has it to do with the preceding lines about Pilate's metaphorical blindness? Well, the following stanza begins with a similarly ambiguous address. Quote, till now your indiscretion set us free. Well, who is your? Men, I presume, not just Pilate, but it is a little fuzzy through here. And then she drops her thesis. Quote, Our mother Eve, who tasted of the tree, giving to Adam what she held most dear, was simply good, and had no power to see the after-coming harm did not appear. So, the core of the defense of Eve, and thus of womankind broadly, is that she was innocent. She had no intention to sin, no purpose to supremacy. She was, quote, simply good. And I take simply here in the more philosophical sense of meaning only or solely. And this brings up something that's always troubled me about the fall in Eden story. Like, what exactly would Adam and Eve have understood by death or dying? When they're admonished against taking the fruit of the tree of knowledge, lest they surely die, did that make any sense to them? How would they have been capable of comprehending a concept like death? It's completely beyond their experience. Indeed, if we take the story on its face, there was no such thing as death in God's creation. I know they say ignorance of the law is no excuse, but I've always wondered about this. Well, this and whether or not Adam and Eve had belly buttons. You ever wondered that? I digress. Lanyer implicates, as does the book of Genesis, the subtle serpent, whom Eve in her innocence would have no reason to suspect of deception. Again, completely outside her experience. Quote, that undiscerning ignorance perceived no guile, and craft that was by him intended. For had she known of what we were bereaved, to his request she had not condescended. This kind of goes to my point. She had no idea what was at stake. Completely made no sense to her. But what about Adam? Here's where Lanyer gets clever. I'm going to read 2 stanzas here. Quote, but surely Adam cannot be excused. Her fault, though great, yet he was most to blame. What weakness offered, strength might have refused. Being Lord of all, the greater was his shame. Although the serpent's craft had her abused, God's holy word ought all his actions frame. For he was Lord and King of all the earth, before poor Eve had either life or breath, who being framed by God's eternal hand, the perfectest man that ever breathed on earth, and from God's mouth received that straight command, the breach whereof he knew was present death. Yea, having power to rule both sea and land, yet with one apple won to lose that breath which God had breathed in his beauteous face, bringing us all in danger and disgrace. Wow, that was what the kids used to call a sick burn. The sense is clear enough, yeah? Why blame Eve? Adam was right there too. And he is a man, and men are stronger and smarter than women, right? And he was the perfectest man. Handcrafted, free-range, single-barrel, locally sourced, organic, GMO-free, small batch, all natural. Made by the Creator himself. How could that guy drop the ball, huh? Riddle me that. And for an apple? Jeez, what a waste. Now, if it was a taco tree, I might have rolled the dice too. Who knows? Anyway. Lanyer sardonically plays to the stereotype of weak and feeble-minded women only to point out the hollowness of male supremacy. Moreover, Lanyer squarely locates the culpability not so much in the taking of the fruit itself, but in the consciousness that doing so is forbidden. Lanyer absolves Eve. Questionably, perhaps, since Eve does repeat the injunction to the serpent. But did she know what it meant? I keep coming back to that. Arguing Eve could not have known what it meant. Adam, however, in his vaunted superiority, should have known, must have known, and so he consciously violated his God's commandment. That, then, is the real sin, willfulness. Lanyer writes, quote, if he would eat it, who had power to stay him? Now this introduces an idea we've mentioned before. I think it was in the King Lear episode about free will as the cause of evil. Pilate's wife indicates Adam's rather nascent ideas of individual sovereignty, which makes her demand of men a few stanzas later, quote, "Then let us have our liberty again, and challenge to yourselves no sovereignty," makes that something of a sliding signifier, liberty and sovereignty, that is, since she seems to see it both as the root of sin and as a positive natural right. Weaving in and out of these stanzas, I detect a gentle critique of contemporary beliefs about Renaissance progress. The line, quote, "If Eve did err, it was for knowledge's sake," refers to the Genesis telling that part of the reason Eve accepted the serpent's words was that the tree of knowledge was, quote, "to be desired to make one wise." To be desired to make one wise. Now, I know that the general takeaway from this story is supposed to be something like, stay in your lane. But it seems to me that Eve is condemned for doing that most human of things, seeking understanding, striving to better comprehend experience. Renaissance humanists certainly saw things that way. And then Lanyer turns that, too, into a rhetorical dagger. Quote, "Yet men will boast of knowledge which he took from Eve's fair hand as from a learned book." So if men brag about being so smart, they got their smarts because the dumb woman got them for them. Woman, then, is positioned as the progenitor of human knowledge, of the sophistication of which men boast. Nice. Now, some of you may have noticed that Pilate's wife is playing both sides against the middle here, but, she's being comprehensive. Leave no turn unstoned. Mrs. Pilate concludes her argument in the Apology's 9th stanza, recapitulating Eve's innocence as a victim of Satan's duplicity. Satan's the serpent, right, in this interpretation, and contrasts that to her husband's incipient culpability. The Roman procurator becomes a form of Adam and the serpent in that his knowledge makes his actions sinful. Quote, "Her weakness did the serpent's words obey, but you in malice God's dear Son betray." Lanyer deftly emphasizes the oppositions at work in the Apology by rhyming the antonyms obey and betray, just as the poem shifts back to its framing device. And that final line is actually enjambed. That is, its meaning continues into the next line, really the next stanza. Should Pilate condemn Jesus of Nazareth, his crime would dwarf all the evils ever committed, and, by extension, the tyranny of men over women would have, quote, "no excuse and no end." This stanza rhymes die and cry with try. And there's also a little bit of front rhyme, I don't know if that's a thing, with by. We know why die is there. The whole poem sees Jesus' potential condemnation as the condemnation of all humanity. Cry, as used in the line, quote, "all mortal sins that do for vengeance cry," is nicely ambiguous. We've got cry as in a call for or demand, so justice cries for retribution. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And cry also as in weep, the sorrow of the penitents or the victims of sin. They're crying. The tension is, of course, according to Christian theology, that Christ will cry and die as retribution for the sin in the garden and all the sins afterwards. Then Lanyer rhymes try. Again, nicely ambiguous. Try as in to attempt. The line speaks of all the world trying to rouse the wrath of God. Quote, "If many worlds would altogether try by all their sins the wrath of God to get." And there you hear the try by adjacent rhyme, front rhyme. But we also hear the word try in its current setting, a criminal trial, a case or cause being pleaded. Pled? Pleaded? Pleaded sounds more proper to me, but I think I say pled in real life. Let's see. AP and Chicago style manuals say pleaded. Oops. Pled is North American or Scottish variation. Ha-ha! Well, I'm North American and of some Scottish ancestry. But pled sounds stupid in the sentence. We also hear the word try in its current setting, a criminal trial, a case or cause being pled. Pleaded. Never mind. Mrs. Pilate, summing up before the judge, begins, quote, "Witness thy wife, O Pilate, speaks for all, who did but dream, and yet a message sent that thou shouldst have nothing to do at all with that just man." From here, the poem rather leaves the feminist defense behind, and Lanyer provides us with a very elegant and interesting fleshing out of the Gospel's sparse rendering of the interplay between the Pilates. She warns him against preferring popularity over justice, like releasing Barabbas, the thief and brigand, instead of the innocent Jesus. She calls upon his professional ethics, or at least marvels at his dullness. Quote, "Art thou a judge, and asketh what to do with one in whom no fault there can be found?" Great line, huh? I can hear the exasperated tone of decades of sitcom moms gobsmacked by sitcom dad's blundering befuddlement. Mrs. Pilate excoriates to his fearfulness, his impiety, and his guilt. She calls him, quote, "a painted wall, a golden sepulchre with rotten bones, from right to wrong, from equity to fall, if none upbraid thee." She notes that Jesus' scourged body, the crown of thorns, and the bloody purple robe with which the soldiers in mockery clad him actually yielded the true, quote, light of grace. So the very opposite of a painted wall or golden sepulchre. The final stanza, though not really part of the Eve's apology proper, begins, quote, "For lo, the guilty doth accuse the just, and faulty judge condemns the innocent." And that seems as good a précis of not only her case to acquit Jesus, but of her case against the injustice of misogyny. It still stuns me that Aemelia Lanyer published this in Jacobean England, and that she was a woman able to make a living by writing such progressive material at such a time. I know, we often like to think in a somewhat Whiggish way that all preceding eras were morally or politically or socially or technologically benighted compared to our own present perfections. So it's easy to think that people didn't even consider the rights of women or enslaved people or Jewish people until, like the mid-1960s. Of course, that's a crude and self-congratulatory way of seeing the arc of history. We've noted Chaucer and Shakespeare take up complex issues of social justice and representation, as did other writers throughout history. But Lanyer is among the first women to actually challenge patriarchal attitudes without relying on the goodwill of men to address their own myopism. She does so on the same intellectual and poetic grounds that they do. She meets them on their own turf, and with confident verse, in a high style, dismantles the textual, logical, historical, theological, and even biological assumptions that have othered women. And as we saw with the quite targeted dedicatory poems at the beginning of her volume, Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, Lanyer consciously seeks to establish a community of good women to her project. It's almost like an antecedent to the 1970s consciousness-raising groups in second-wave feminism. Now, this, to me, seems evidence that we in the 21st century are not so morally advanced over our early modern ancestors. The social issues of today are those of yesterday, and people were as aware then as they are now. Yet, while noting Lanyer's importance as an early and professional advocate for women's dignity, we must not reduce her poetry to mere pamphleteering or agitation. Despite the persisting vogue among some scholars to level all forms of cultural expression, regardless of mode or genre or intent, they say a text is a text is a text, as if there were no difference between a news bulletin, a grocery ad, or a sonnet. And they usually do so in order to reveal a rather crudely understood framework of social power relations. I fear, actually, I may have left that impression in this episode, that Lanyer's art is only significant insofar as it reveals the oppressive workings of the patriarchy. I hope I haven't, because that kind of reading, if left at that, is absolute ass water. Serious readers must remember that writers choose their modes of expression. They choose their words, and they choose their effects with great care to produce a particular effect or meaning. While we might not have absolutely accurate access to authorial intention, and we also must allow that a text's meanings can extend beyond the author's control, we must attend very carefully to what the author's choices convey, what the writer hoped to communicate to us. Lanyer wrote a poem, a meditation on the Passion of Christ, and in that meditation saw a particular dynamic of social relations that seemed absurd to her in light of her understanding of the poem's main subject. Lanyer is an artist, not merely a polemicist, and I hope that's been clear in my discussion today. And I'd like to end this show with the end of Miss Aemilia's book. At its conclusion, she explains how the title Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, Hail God, King of the Jews, came about. In doing so, she invokes the poetic trope of the dream vision, one which we've discussed in many episodes. Here, certainly, we see that Lanyer sees her work as something more transcendental than the evanescence of social politics. And note that she speaks of her intentions and that she feels that she's been chosen to write. She says, quote, "Gentle reader, if thou desire to be resolved why I give this title, Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, know for certain that it was delivered unto me in sleep many years before I had any intent to write in this manner, and was quite out of my memory until I had written the Passion of Christ, when immediately it came into my remembrance what I had dreamed long before, and thinking it a significant token that I was appointed to perform this work, I gave the very same words I received in sleep as the fittest title I could devise for this book." Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you soon.